There is a moment, probably more than once a day, where you quietly edit yourself before anyone even asks you to. You soften an opinion before you say it out loud. You laugh a little harder than you actually feel. You agree with something you don't really agree with, just to keep the room comfortable. You've probably done this so many times for so many years that you don't even notice it happening anymore. It just feels like being polite, being easy to get along with, being a good person to have around. Carl Jung would look at that pattern and tell you something that might be hard to hear at first. He would tell you that the version of you doing all that quiet editing is not actually you. It is something he called the persona. And he would tell you that the more you let it run your life, the further you drift from the person you actually are. Until one day you look up and realize you've spent years being liked by people who never actually met you at all. Before we go any further, if that already landed somewhere real, hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This is going to get honest, and I want you here for the whole thing. Jung used the word persona on purpose, because it comes from the old word for a mask worn by actors on stage. He wasn't being poetic for the sake of it. He meant it literally. The persona is the mask you present to the world, the socially acceptable version of yourself that gets built early in life to help you survive in families, schools, workplaces, and friend groups that all had their own rules about what was allowed and what wasn't. This mask isn't fake in the sense of being a lie you tell on purpose. It's more like a survival tool you built so young and so gradually that you forgot it was ever a construction at all. You started wearing it before you had any say in the matter, and by now it fits so well you've mistaken it for your actual face. The problem isn't that the mask exists. Jung was clear that everyone needs some kind of persona just to function in society, some socially workable version of themselves to present at work, with strangers, in situations that require a bit of polish. The problem is when the mask stops being a tool you use and starts being the only thing left when you've worn it so consistently for so long that you no longer know what's underneath it, or worse, when you've convinced yourself that there was never anything underneath it to begin with. Think about how this actually shows up in your life. Think about the version of you that exists in a room full of people whose approval you want. Notice how quickly you can read the room and adjust, softer here, funnier there, quieter about the opinion that might cause friction, louder about the one that will get a laugh. This adjusting isn't necessarily dishonest. Some of it is just basic social awareness, and there's nothing wrong with that. But somewhere along the way, for most people, that adjusting stops being occasional and becomes constant. It stops being something you do in specific rooms and becomes something you do everywhere, with everyone, all the time, until the muscle memory of shaping yourself to be liked becomes so automatic that you genuinely lose track of what you would say, feel, or want if nobody in the room had an opinion about you at all. Here's the part Jung was trying to warn people about, and it's the part that explains a very specific kind of exhaustion a lot of people carry without knowing where it comes from. Every time you shape yourself to be liked instead of to be honest, you are spending something. It isn't obvious in the moment, because being liked feels good, it feels safe, it feels like the room stays warm and nobody gets upset with you. But the cost shows up later, quietly, in the form of a strange emptiness that doesn't seem to have a clear cause. You get the approval you were chasing, and it doesn't actually satisfy you the way you thought it would, because the approval was never really directed at you. It was directed at the mask, and some deep, honest part of you knows the difference, even when you won't admit it out loud, which is why being liked in that hollow way can leave you feeling more alone than being disliked honestly ever could. I want you to sit with something Jung believed that most people never really let themselves consider. He believed that everything you push down, deny, or refuse to show other people doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. It collects in what he called the shadow, the part of your psyche holding everything the persona wasn't allowed to express. Every opinion you swallowed to keep the peace, every anger you smiled through, every need you didn't voice because it might make you seem difficult. All of it goes into that same reservoir. And the reservoir doesn't stay quiet forever. It leaks out sideways, in irritability you can't explain, in resentment toward people who didn't do anything specifically wrong to you, in a heaviness that follows you even on days when everything on the surface looks fine. Chasing being liked isn't a neutral habit with no cost. Every time you choose the mask over the honest reaction, you're making a small deposit into a reservoir that is going to demand something back from you eventually, usually at a moment you didn't choose, and in a form you don't recognize as connected to years of quiet self-editing. This is where I need you to actually think about your own life for a second, not in the abstract but specifically. Think about a relationship where you have been performing a version of agreeableness for so long that you're not sure the other person has ever seen you disagree with them. Think about a job where you said yes to things you didn't actually have room for, over and over, because saying no felt like it would cost you the image you'd built of being easy to work with. Think about a version of yourself you present online, curated just enough that it earns approval, while the messier, more complicated version of you stays carefully out of frame. None of these are moral failures. Jung wasn't interested in shaming people for having a persona. He was interested in what happens when people forget they have one. When the mask becomes so permanent that the question of who you actually are underneath it starts to feel unanswerable, even to yourself. Now here's something that might reframe your entire relationship with the people who don't seem to like you. Because this is where Jung's ideas get genuinely useful instead of just interesting. If the persona is a mask built specifically to earn approval, then being disliked while wearing an honest version of yourself is actually more informative than being liked while wearing a mask. Think about that for a moment, because it inverts something most of us were taught to believe. We're taught that being liked is the goal, and being disliked is the failure. But if most of the liking you've collected over the years was aimed at a curated performance rather than the actual person underneath it, then that approval was never really telling you anything true about your worth. It was just confirming that your mask was doing its job. Meanwhile, the moments when someone doesn't like the honest version of you, the moments when you say what you actually think, and it doesn't land well, those moments are strange evidence in your favor, because they mean you actually showed up as yourself instead of as a performance built to be palatable. This doesn't mean disapproval is automatically good or that you should go looking for it. It means disapproval earned by honesty is worth infinitely more than approval earned by disappearing. I want to talk about why this chase for being liked runs so deep in so many people. Because it isn't random, and it isn't a personal weakness either. For most of human history, being disliked by your group had real physical stakes. Exile from a tribe wasn't an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Your nervous system evolved in an environment where social rejection and physical danger were tightly linked, and that wiring didn't disappear just because you now live in a world where a stranger's disapproval on a screen can't actually hurt you. Your body still reacts to disapproval the way it once reacted to threat, with a spike of anxiety, a flush of shame, an urgent need to fix the situation immediately. This means the pull to be liked isn't some shallow, vain impulse you should be embarrassed about. It's an old survival mechanism doing exactly what it was built to do, just badly calibrated for the world you're actually living in now, where you can survive perfectly well without a specific coworker's approval or a stranger's validation online, even though your nervous system insists otherwise in the moment. Understanding where this comes from matters because it changes how you respond to the discomfort of being disliked. Instead of treating that discomfort as proof that something has gone wrong, you can start recognizing it as an old alarm system firing off in a situation it was never designed for. The alarm is loud and convincing, but loud and convincing isn't the same as accurate. When you feel that familiar tightening in your chest after someone reacts coldly to something honest you said, you don't have to immediately soften your next sentence to make the alarm stop ringing. You can notice the alarm, acknowledge that it's doing what it always does, and then make a choice that isn't ruled by it. This is not something you master in a day. It's a practice the same way anything real is a practice, but the moment you can name the alarm for what it is, you take away a huge amount of its power over your daily decisions. Let's talk about what actually happens to a person who spends years, maybe decades, prioritizing being liked over being honest. This isn't a dramatic collapse most of the time. It's quieter and, in some ways, sadder than that. It's waking up at 40 or 50 and realizing you can list dozens of people who like you and struggle to name more than a couple who actually know you. It's noticing that your opinions have become so flexible, so responsive to whoever you're talking to, that you're no longer sure what you actually believe when you're alone, with no one to please. It's feeling a strange grief, you can't quite locate the source of, because the loss isn't a single event, it's the slow, accumulated cost of thousands of small moments where you chose the mask over the face underneath it. Jung would say this is one of the most common tragedies of adult life. Not the dramatic downfall, but the quiet erosion of an actual self, replaced piece by piece with a performance so smooth and so well-liked that almost nobody, including the person wearing it, notices what's missing until much later than they'd like. I want to be careful here because I don't want you to hear this and swing to the opposite extreme, deciding that the answer is to become deliberately abrasive, or to treat every social softening as some kind of betrayal of your true self. That would just be another mask, a different performance built around being liked for being unfiltered instead of being disliked for wearing a persona too tightly. Jung wasn't advocating for cruelty disguised as authenticity. Plenty of people who claim they're just being honest are actually using that label to excuse behavior that genuinely hurts people, and calling it your true self doesn't make it exempt from basic decency. The goal isn't to stop caring how your words land on people. The goal is to stop needing everyone to like the result before you're willing to say something true. There's a real difference between tact, which is choosing how to say something honest with care for the person hearing it, and self-erasure, which is choosing not to say it at all because their comfort matters more to you than your own honesty. Tact is a skill worth keeping. Self-erasure is the thing Jung was actually warning you about. There's a particular version of this trap worth naming because it catches people who think they've already solved the problem. Some people, once they learn about personas and masks, start performing authenticity itself, announcing how honest and unfiltered they are as a kind of new brand, almost louder and more attention-seeking than the agreeable mask they claim to have dropped. This is worth watching for in yourself because the ego is remarkably good at absorbing even the language of self-awareness and turning it into a new costume. The real thing doesn't need to announce itself constantly. It doesn't need an audience to confirm it's happening. If you find yourself performing your own honesty for other people's approval of how honest you are, you haven't actually left the persona behind. You've just found a cleverer disguise for the same old need. The test isn't whether you're saying bold things. The test is whether you'd still say them if nobody was around to be impressed by the fact that you did. Let's talk about the specific discomfort of disappointing someone you genuinely care about, because this is often where the whole project falls apart for people. It's one thing to imagine being honest with a stranger or an acquaintance whose opinion of you barely matters. It's a completely different thing to imagine telling someone you love that you disagree with them, that you can't take on the favor they're asking of you, that something they did actually hurt you instead of being fine like you keep insisting it is. The stakes here feel enormous, because these are the relationships that actually matter, and the fear of damaging them can feel like the one exception where the mask is justified. But consider what you're actually protecting when you stay silent with the people closest to you. You're not protecting the relationship, you're protecting a version of the relationship that was already built on a slightly false premise, one where they think they know your real reactions, when actually they've only ever received the edited version. If that relationship can only survive on the edited version of you, it was already more fragile than it looked, and finding that out sooner gently and with care is kinder to both of you than discovering it decades in, after years of quiet resentment have already done their damage underneath the surface. I also want to talk about the specific role that praise plays in keeping this whole pattern alive, because praise is one of the most effective tools the persona uses to keep itself in charge. When you get praised for being agreeable, for being easy, for never causing friction, that praise feels wonderful in the moment, and it directly reinforces the exact behavior that's slowly costing you your honest self. This is worth noticing carefully because not all praise is neutral. Some praise is actually praising the mask specifically, rewarding you for how well you disappeared, how smoothly you avoided friction, how little of your actual self showed up to disrupt anyone's comfort. Learning to notice which compliments are aimed at your persona rather than at you is an uncomfortable skill to build, because it means you have to stop accepting all approval as equally good news. Some of it is quietly training you to keep performing the exact pattern that's hollowing you out. And the sooner you can spot the difference, the sooner that particular trap loses its grip on you. Let's talk about the specific people in your life whose approval you find yourself chasing the hardest. because this often points to something worth examining more closely. Very often, the people whose approval we chase most desperately are not chosen because of who they actually are, but because of who they remind us of: an early caregiver whose approval felt conditional, a parent whose love seemed to depend on performing a certain way, an authority figure whose disapproval once carried real consequences. Jung believed we often reenact old patterns without realizing it, seeking the same kind of validation from new people that we once desperately needed from someone much earlier in our lives, as if finally earning it this time might retroactively heal something that happened decades ago. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it can be humbling. The coworker whose opinion of you feels disproportionately important might not actually hold that much power over your real life. What they might be doing, without either of you realizing it, is standing in for someone else entirely, someone whose approval you never quite got, or got only when you performed correctly, and some old, young part of you is still trying to solve that original problem through this new, unrelated person. This matters because it means a lot of the pressure you feel to be liked isn't actually coming from present, adult reality. It's an old loop playing out on a new screen. And once you can recognize the loop for what it is, you gain something valuable: the ability to separate the actual stakes of this current relationship from the much older, much heavier stakes your nervous system is quietly attaching to it. The coworker who seems a little cold toward you probably isn't a referendum on your worth as a person, but it can feel exactly like one if some unresolved younger part of you is still trying to earn approval it never fully received the first time around. Recognizing this doesn't erase the discomfort instantly, but it gives you a much clearer view of what's actually happening, which is often enough to loosen the grip the situation has on you. Let's talk about what it actually looks like to live differently, because none of this is useful if it stays theoretical. It starts small, almost embarrassingly small. It starts with letting a slightly awkward silence sit in a conversation instead of rushing to fill it with something agreeable. It starts with saying, "I don't actually agree with that," gently, honestly, without immediately following it up with 3 qualifiers designed to soften the disagreement into nothing. It starts with posting the version of your life that's actually true, instead of the version calibrated for maximum approval. It starts with noticing the specific moment, and there usually is one right before you speak, where you feel yourself deciding whether to say the real thing or the safe thing, and choosing just this once, the real thing, even if your chest is tight while you do it. These moments feel small individually. They add up to something enormous over time. The same slow way the persona itself was built. One small accommodation at a time, except now you're building something honest instead. I want to address the fear directly, because I don't think it's fair to talk about all of this without acknowledging how real the fear actually feels. If you drop the performance, some people are going to like you less. This isn't a hypothetical risk designed to scare you into staying safe. It's simply true, and I'd be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. Some relationships in your life are specifically built around the performed version of you. And when that version changes, those relationships will feel the strain, sometimes enough that they don't survive it. This is not a reason to keep the mask on forever. It's a filtering mechanism, uncomfortable as it is. The people who only ever liked your performance were never actually going to be able to hold the real thing anyway, and finding that out now, rather than after another decade of exhausting yourself to maintain an act, is not a loss. It's information you needed, delivered a little painfully, but delivered honestly. There is also something on the other side of that fear that almost nobody talks about enough, because the conversation usually stops at the risk of losing people. What actually happens for most people who do this slowly and honestly over time is that a smaller number of relationships get dramatically better, deeper, more real, and more sustaining than the wider, shallower network of approval they used to maintain. You start to notice which people actually enjoy the honest version of you, not just tolerate it, but genuinely prefer it, relax around it, trust it more than they ever trusted the polished performance. Those relationships become the ones actually worth investing your energy into, because they're not built on a foundation that requires constant maintenance to keep from collapsing. A relationship built on your persona requires you to keep performing indefinitely, forever, without rest, because the moment the performance slips, the relationship built on it slips too. A relationship built on the honest version of you requires nothing but continuing to exist as yourself, which, however difficult that sounds right now, is a much lighter thing to carry over the course of an entire life. I want to leave you with something Jung believed was the actual point of all of this, something he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a fully integrated person instead of a collection of masks assembled to please whoever happens to be in the room. He didn't believe this process ever fully completes. He believed it's ongoing, uncomfortable, sometimes lonely, and never finished, because there's always another layer of persona to notice and question, always another old pattern quietly running the show without your permission. But he also believed it was the only path towards something worth having, a life that actually belongs to you instead of a life spent managing an audience. This isn't a destination you arrive at and then relax into permanently. It's a practice you return to again and again every time you catch yourself editing the truth down to something more palatable, every time you notice the old alarm ringing and have to decide again whether to obey it or not. You don't have to burn down every relationship in your life to start this. You don't have to become someone who says every harsh thought out loud without care for how it lands. Because that isn't honesty. That's just a different costume. What you can start doing today, in small and quiet ways, is noticing the gap between what you actually think and what you're about to say, and closing that gap just slightly more often than you used to. Notice the moment before you agree with something you don't believe. Notice the moment before you laugh at something that didn't actually land as funny. Notice the moment before you say I'm fine when you're not. You don't have to fix all of it at once. You just have to start closing the gap, one honest moment at a time, and trust that the version of you underneath the mask is actually worth uncovering, even if some people along the way decide they preferred the performance. That trust is really the whole thing when you strip away everything else. Somewhere along the way you learned to doubt that the honest version of you was enough on its own, worth knowing, worth keeping around without heavy editing. Everything the mask ever did was built on top of that original doubt. Undoing it doesn't happen through one dramatic act of defiance. It happens through small, repeated evidence gathered slowly, that the real version of you can stand in a room, say something true, and still be someone worth being around. Each time that happens, the old doubt gets a little quieter, and the mask gets a little less necessary to hold up on your own. If this made you look at your own persona a little more honestly, do two things for me right now. Hit like, because it tells this channel to keep making things like this, instead of the same watered-down advice everyone else puts out. And subscribe, because I'm not done with this conversation, not even close. I'll see you in the next one.